After my divorce at 73, I became homeless. My ex-husband laughed. Nobody needs you when you're that old. One day, a lawyer came up to me. Ma'am, your first husband from the 1970s has died. He left you a fortune of $47 million, but there is one condition. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm happy you're here with me. Please like this video, listen to my story until the end, and tell me which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought the word homeless would ever describe me. Not at 73. Not after 41 years of keeping a house clean, raising children, baking pies on Sundays, and truly, deeply believing that the man sleeping beside me was my partner for life. But life has a way of proving you wrong in the cruelest way. And mine chose to do it on a Tuesday morning in October when Gerald Whitmore put a manila envelope on the kitchen table, poured himself a cup of coffee, and told me our marriage was over. Gerald and I had met in 1981 at a church potluck in Savannah, Georgia. He was a neat, confident man with a salesman's smile and a contractor's hands. And I was a widow for 7 years, still trying to find my balance after my first husband, Robert Caldwell, had supposedly died suddenly of a heart attack in 1974. Robert and I had been young and poor and wildly in love, married only 4 years before God took him. I had grieved the right way, raised my daughter Patricia by myself, and finally let myself believe in a second chance. Gerald seemed like that chance. For a long time, he was. We built a life in a modest but comfortable house on Sycamore Lane in Augusta. Gerald's contracting business did well through the 80s and 90s. I worked as a school librarian for 27 years. We took trips to the Florida coast, went to our grandchildren's birthday parties, argued about the thermostat, and did all the ordinary things that make up a life. I was not foolish. I knew Gerald had a temper, that he could be dismissive, that he sometimes treated my opinions like background noise. But I told myself no marriage was perfect. I told myself that was love. The first warning signs came about 3 years before the divorce, though I only understood them for what they were later. Gerald began spending more evenings away from home, saying he had late meetings with clients. He changed the password on his phone. He stopped asking about my day. Small things, the kind of things a woman from my generation learns to excuse because we were raised to keep the peace. But then came the credit card statements I was not supposed to see. Dinners at restaurants we had never gone to together, a weekend charge from a hotel in Charleston. I asked him once, carefully, not accusingly. He looked at me with a flat look in his eyes that I had never seen before, and said, "You're imagining things, Dorothy." Dorothy, that is my name. Dorothy May Whitmore, née Collins, formerly Caldwell, and I was not imagining things. The envelope he placed on the table that Tuesday held divorce papers already prepared by his attorney. He had been planning this for months while I made his meals and washed his shirts. The divorce itself took 8 months and left me with almost nothing. Our house was in Gerald's name alone, a detail from our early marriage that I had never thought to question because why would you question such a thing when you trusted someone? I received a small settlement, enough to cover perhaps 6 months of modest living, and my personal belongings. That was all. By January, I was living in a single room at the Magnolia Inn on the edge of town, a tired roadside motel that rented by the week to people in transition, which was a polite way to say people who had nowhere else to go. The room smelled like old carpet and mildew. The heater rattled. I was 73 years old, sleeping on a mattress with a spring sticking through the left side, and I cried every night for the first month. Not from self-pity, I told myself, but from pure disbelief that this was where a lifetime of devotion had brought me. Gerald, I later heard through mutual acquaintances, had moved his girlfriend, a woman named Rhonda, 54 years old and a former client, into our house on Sycamore Lane within 3 weeks of the divorce being final. When Patricia told me this, she also told me what Gerald had said when someone apparently mentioned my name at a social gathering. He had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Dorothy, she's on her own now. Nobody wants a woman that old. She should have thought about that before she got boring." I sat with those words for a long time. I let them hurt the way they needed to hurt. And then I folded them away somewhere cold inside myself and tried to think about what to do next. It was on a Wednesday in late February, gray skies, the smell of rain coming, that I was sitting in the small motel lobby pretending to read a magazine when a man in a dark suit walked through the door and asked the clerk at the desk if there was a Mrs. Dorothy Whitmore staying there. I looked up. He was about 50, with careful eyes and a leather briefcase. And he introduced himself as James Harrove, an estate attorney from Atlanta. He sat down across from me in one of the cracked lobby chairs, set his briefcase on his knees, and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I have been looking for you for some time. Your first husband, Robert Caldwell, passed away last month." I stared at him. "Robert died in 1974, I said. He slowly shook his head. "No, ma'am. Robert Caldwell survived. He left Savannah in 1974 under circumstances I will explain fully. He passed away on January 9th of this year in Portland, Oregon. He left an estate worth about $47 million. He paused. "And you are named as the main beneficiary." The magazine slipped from my hands. Outside, the rain began. "There is," he added quietly, "one condition." I did not sleep that night. I lay on that rattling mattress in room 11 of the Magnolia Inn and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and tried to put the facts into some kind of sense. Robert Caldwell. My Robert, the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the roadside because he could not afford a florist. The man who had kissed my forehead the morning he was supposed to have died had not died. He had left. And for 50 years he had lived a completely different life somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, apparently building a fortune while I had grieved him, buried an empty coffin in my heart, remarried, grown old, and ended up in that room. The question that kept coming back was not even about the inheritance. It was simpler and more painful. Why? Why had Robert faked his death or disappeared or whatever the truth turned out to be? What had I done or not done that made a man choose to vanish instead of simply leave? And what kind of woman does that make me? To have been abandoned twice by two different men in two completely different ways. I gave myself until dawn to grieve the version of the past I thought I had known. I sat up as the first gray light came through the curtain, made myself a cup of instant coffee with the little motel kettle, and decided to stop asking questions about why and start asking questions about what. What was the condition tied to the inheritance? What would it require from me? What were my real choices here? Mr. Hargrove had given me his card and said he would return the next morning. We had agreed on 10 o'clock. I had the hours in between to think clearly. My immediate situation was this. I had about $400 left from my divorce settlement. My motel room was paid for through the end of the week. I had no car. Gerald had kept the vehicle we bought together, and the judge had allowed it because the title was in his name alone. I had a cell phone on a prepaid plan, a suitcase of clothes, and a box of books and photographs that Patricia was storing in her garage. I was 73 years old, in reasonable health for my age, with mild arthritis in my left knee, and a stubbornness that had always annoyed Gerald more than any other quality I had. That stubbornness felt that morning like the most valuable thing I owned. When Mr. Harrove arrived at 10 o'clock, he was punctual and professional, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the road, a small act that I noticed and appreciated. We sat in the lobby again. He opened his briefcase and laid out documents in a careful, organized way that told me he was a thorough man. Robert Caldwell, he explained, had left Savannah in the spring of 1974, not because of any emergency or death, but because he had made a disastrous financial choice, a bad investment that had left him owing money to people who were not patient about being paid back. He had panicked. He was 28 years old, frightened, and instead of facing the situation, he had disappeared, letting people assume he had died because he had not corrected them. It was cowardly. Mr. Hargrove said that word plainly and without apology on Robert's behalf. Cowardly. Robert had eventually rebuilt his life in Oregon under a version of his name, going by his middle name, James, and using his mother's maiden name professionally. He had entered the timber industry, made smart investments over the years, and died a wealthy man. He had never remarried. He had, according to documents in his estate files, kept a single photograph of me throughout his life. The condition of the inheritance was this. Because Robert had legally died without a death certificate ever being officially issued, and because the legal problems caused by his disappearance created a probate situation that required proof, I would need to formally confirm my identity as his original wife and lawful spouse at the time of his disappearance, submit our original marriage documents for review, and take part in a probate hearing in Portland within 60 days. If the probate court was satisfied, the estate would pass to me as stated in Robert's will, which had been written 8 years before his death and updated twice since then. $47 million. The number still did not feel real. But the cracked plastic chair under me was real, and the $400 in my purse was real, and Gerald's laughter was real. "I'll do it," I said. Mr. Hargrove nodded as if he had expected nothing less. He explained that the estate would cover all travel costs, legal fees, and reasonable expenses during the process. He would arrange a flight to Portland. I would need to gather whatever original documents I still had from my marriage to Robert, photographs, the marriage certificate if I had it, letters, anything that proved our relationship. I knew exactly where those things were. There was a small tin box in the bottom of the storage carton at Patricia's house. I had carried it through every move of my adult life without ever opening it because opening it had felt like pressing on a bruise that never fully healed. Now I would need to open it. I called Patricia that afternoon. She was surprised to hear from me. Our relationship had become strained since the divorce, not because she had taken Gerald's side, but because grief and shame have a way of making people hard to reach. I told her I needed to come by and collect some things from the carton in her garage. I did not tell her why, not yet. I needed to understand the full shape of this before I shared it with anyone because I had learned at 73 that other people's opinions have a way of taking over your decisions before you have had the chance to form them yourself. The tin box was exactly where I remembered it, sitting in Patricia's garage on a cold metal shelf between a bag of potting soil and a box of Christmas ornaments. I opened it for the first time in decades. Inside were our marriage certificate dated March 14, 1970, a handful of photographs, 3 letters Robert had written to me during a summer job he had taken in Mon before we were married, and a small pressed flower, a roadside wildflower dried as thin as paper, tucked inside a folded piece of notebook paper. I held it carefully and did not cry. I was making a plan. There was no room for crying in a plan. The flight to Portland was the first time I had been on an airplane in 11 years. Gerald had stopped wanting to travel sometime in the mid-2000s, and I had accepted that preference the way I had accepted so many of his preferences. Sitting in the window seat, watching Augusta disappear under the clouds, I felt something I had not expected. Lightness. Not happiness exactly, but the special feeling of a door opening onto a hallway you did not know was there. Mr. Hargrove, James, as he had asked me to call him, had arranged a clean, quiet hotel near the probate attorney's office in downtown Portland. The room was warm, the bed was firm, and there was a window that looked out onto a row of bare-limbed trees along a wet sidewalk. It was more dignified than anything I had lived in for months, and I took a long bath that first evening simply because I could, and because dignity matters, even in small private ways. The probate attorney's name was Margaret Cho, a precise, calm woman in her late 40s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with the careful efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years turning complicated human situations into legal language. She went through the documents I had brought with close attention, the marriage certificate, the photographs, the letters. She noted that the handwriting on the letters matched samples in Robert's own personal papers. She photographed everything and told me that the formal hearing would be scheduled within 3 weeks, depending on a standard waiting period for any other parties to come forward and challenge the probate. Other parties, I repeated. She looked at me over her glasses. Mr. Caldwell had a daughter, she said, from a relationship in the early 80s. Her name is Sandra Caldwell. She is 51 years old and lives in Seattle. She was not named in the will. I took this in. A daughter. Robert had a daughter somewhere without me. He had built part of a family, just not with me, and apparently not with any formal commitment to Sandra's mother either. Has she been notified? I asked. She has, Miss Cho said. She was informed of the estate and its terms about 2 weeks before we found you, which meant Sandra Caldwell had known about the inheritance and about me for 2 weeks before James Harrove had walked into the Magnolia Inn. I thought about what 2 weeks of knowing gives a person, 2 weeks to talk to attorneys of her own, 2 weeks to plan. I was not naturally suspicious, but I was also no longer naive. The call came 3 days later while I was sitting in a small cafe near the hotel eating a bowl of soup. My cell phone buzzed with an unknown number, a Seattle area code. I answered. The voice was controlled, but with an edge under it like a wire pulled too tight. Is this Dorothy Whitmore? It is, I said. My name is Sandra Caldwell. I think we need to talk. She suggested a meeting. Neutral ground, she said, a coffee shop in the Pearl District. I agreed, and then I immediately called James Harrove and told him. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "You do not have to meet with her. She has no legal standing to challenge the will on her own." I know, I said, but I want to see what she wants. What Sandra Caldwell wanted became clear within the first 5 minutes of our meeting. She was a tall woman, sharp and angular, with Robert's coloring. I could see that right away, a strange echo of a face I had loved, but with a coldness in her expression that Robert, whatever his faults, had never had. She had a younger man with her whom she introduced as her boyfriend Derek, who said nothing the whole time, but sat with the special alertness of someone ready to be useful in some unclear way. "You were married to my father for 4 years, Sandra said, 50 years ago. I lived with him, took care of him in his final years, managed his house and his affairs." "That must have been meaningful," I said carefully. "He left me nothing," she said. The wire under her voice pulled tighter. "Nothing. Not the house, not the accounts. Everything to you. A woman he had not seen in half a century." "I did not know he was alive," I said. "That's convenient," she replied. I noticed then that she was watching my hands. Specifically, watching to see if they shook. I kept them still around my soup spoon. "Sandra," I said as kindly as I could. "I understand this is painful, but I cannot change what your father decided." She leaned forward slightly. "I think you should consider a settlement, voluntary, before this becomes something difficult for everyone." "How much?" I asked. She named a figure, $15 million, in exchange for me stepping back from the probate process completely. "Let the estate fall into a default state," she explained, "where she could then bring her own claim as a dependent caregiver." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about room 11 at the Magnolia Inn. I thought about the marriage certificate dated March 14, 1970. I thought about the pressed wildflower. "I'll need to think about it," I said. I had no plan to think about it, but I needed to know what she would do next. I found out sooner than expected. When I returned to my hotel that evening, I discovered that someone had gone through my room. Nothing was taken. My documents were in a lockbox at the attorney's office, but the room had been searched, quietly and professionally, a fact confirmed by the slight misplacement of things I had left in certain positions out of the old careful habit of a woman who had learned to notice things. I photographed the room before touching anything, then called James Hargrove and then the hotel manager. The manager checked the keycard entry log. Someone had entered the room during a 90-minute window that afternoon using a keycard. That was my first direct proof that Sandra Caldwell was not going to accept this quietly. James Harrove took the hotel security situation seriously. By the next morning, he had arranged for me to move to a different hotel, smaller, less noticeable, paid under the estate's account in a way that would not be easy to trace through public records. He also connected me with a local attorney named Paul Rest who specialized in probate litigation because it was now clear that Sandra intended to bring a formal challenge. My plan, such as it was, rested on 3 parts. First, complete the probate hearing successfully by presenting all available documents proving my identity and my legal standing as Robert's wife. Second, make sure that all evidence of Sandra's interference, including the hotel break-in, was formally documented and placed into the legal record. Third, remain calm, patient, and visible only when it served my purpose. The documentation part required work. James and Paul together had already gathered the estate records, Robert's will, and his financial history. What I could add was the personal history, the marriage certificate, the letters, the photographs, and something James had found in Robert's personal belongings that neither of us had expected, a journal. Robert had kept a journal now and then for decades, and in several entries from the late 1990s and early 2000s, he had written about me by name. He wrote about regret in the careful, measured language of a man who had spent decades not saying what he truly felt. He wrote that leaving had been the worst decision of his life. He wrote my name as if it still carried weight after 30 years of silence. I read those journal entries in Paul Reston's office on a gray Thursday afternoon, and I held myself together with the focus of someone handling something delicate. I was not going to cry in a lawyer's office. I was not going to give Sandra Caldwell's actions the satisfaction of breaking my composure. I simply nodded and said, "Can we use this?" Paul said, "Yes." The journal was part of the estate's personal property and fully allowed as evidence of the testator's intent. Sandra filed her formal probate challenge 2 days later, claiming that Robert Caldwell had been mentally weaker in his final years, that I had somehow used unfair influence from 2,000 miles away while not even knowing he was alive, and that his true intention had been to provide for his caregiving daughter. It was a weak argument, legally speaking, Paul assured me. But weak arguments still require answers, still take time and energy, still cost money. The estate was covering my costs. Sandra was presumably paying for her legal fight from whatever personal resources she had. Then she escalated. On a Tuesday evening, my daughter Patricia called me from Augusta, upset in a way she was trying to control, but failing. She told me that a man had come to her house that afternoon, well-dressed, polite, saying he was doing due diligence for an unnamed estate interest. He had asked Patricia questions about my mental health, about my drinking habits, about my relationship with Robert during our marriage. He had suggested, without saying it directly, that there were concerns about my ability to manage a large estate responsibly. He had then left Patricia with a business card for Derek, Sandra's silent boyfriend from the Pearl District Cafe. I stayed calm on the phone. I reassured Patricia. Then I got off the call and sat in my small hotel room for a few minutes with my hands in my lap, feeling the special kind of anger that comes not from heat but from cold, the kind that makes things clearer instead of setting them on fire. The next morning, I told Paul Reston. He immediately wrote a cease and desist letter to Sandra's attorney, documenting this contact as possible witness intimidation. Sandra's attorney answered angrily that Derek had made an independent personal inquiry and that his client had no responsibility for his actions. Paul noted for the record that Derek's business card identified him as a consultant employed by a private investigations firm that Sandra Caldwell had hired 3 weeks earlier. That was the second piece of direct evidence in the legal record. Sandra called me directly that evening. She had dropped the careful control of our first meeting. Her voice was no longer a tight wire. It was a blade. "You are making this very difficult," she said. "I'm simply taking part in a legal process," I replied. "You do not understand what I can do," she said. "I have resources. I have people. I have history with my father that you do not have and cannot copy." "What you have," I said, is documented witness intimidation and an unauthorized entry into my hotel room on record with the Portland Police Bureau. I had filed the report 2 days earlier, quietly, on Paul's advice. I think you should speak with your attorney before you continue this conversation. There was a long silence. Then she said, "You're going to regret this." And ended the call. But she did not contact me again that week or the week after. In the silence that followed, I allowed myself a few days of something close to rest. Not relaxation exactly. I was not a woman who relaxed easily, and the hearing was still 3 weeks away, but I took walks along the waterfront in the mornings. I ate proper meals. I bought a small notebook and began writing things down. Not strategy, just thoughts. Memories of Robert. The special way the light fell through the hotel window onto the floorboards at 4 in the afternoon. The fact that I was 73 years old, possibly about to change my life completely, and still standing. That, I decided, was not nothing. The offer arrived by formal letter delivered through Sandra's attorney to Paul Reston's office on a Friday morning. It was written in careful legal language, but the meaning was this. Sandra Caldwell was prepared to drop her challenge completely in exchange for a voluntary reallocation of the estate. $20 million to me, $27 million to Sandra, with all legal disputes considered settled. Her attorney described it as a gesture of goodwill, a desire, the letter said, to honor the spirit of reconciliation that Mr. Caldwell himself would surely have wanted. I read it twice slowly in Paul's office. Then I set it on the desk. Robert Caldwell had not left Sandra Caldwell a single dollar. He had known her. He had lived near her. She had, by her own account, cared for him in his final years, and he had still left everything to me, to a woman he had abandoned half a century ago, who had not known he was alive. That was not an accident or a mistake. That was a decision made by a man who had spent 50 years living with one specific regret. $27 million to Sandra Caldwell would be a direct rejection of that decision. Tell them no, I said. Paul looked at me steadily. You understand this may make the hearing more hostile. I understand. And that Sandra has said she plans to bring forward witnesses about Robert's mental state in his final years. She can bring what she likes, I said. So can we. What I had, and what Sandra did not know the full extent of, was that Robert's main doctor in Portland, a Dr. Ellen Park who had treated him for the last 6 years of his life, had already given a written statement to the estate, confirming that Robert had been mentally clear and legally competent throughout the period in which his will had been written and updated. The last update, made 18 months before his death, had been witnessed by his attorney, his accountant, and Dr. Park herself. The mental weakness argument was not just weak. It was going to fall apart under documented medical testimony. I did not share this information with Sandra's side. I let the letter sit, formally declined it, and waited. I found that the waiting suited me. Over the past weeks, I had developed what I could only describe as a cold clarity. Not bitterness, not hardness, but something more like what I imagine deep water feels like. Pressure from all sides. But still. I walked my morning routes along the waterfront. I ate my meals. I slept more soundly than I had in years, which surprised me and then did not, because I was no longer in the same house as a man who did not love me, and that particular weight, once gone, turned out to have been heavier than I knew. The social support, when it came from a direction I had not expected. In the small cafe I had started visiting most mornings, there was a woman who sat at the corner table with a crossword puzzle every day between 8 and 9. She was about 68, compact and alert, with silver hair cut short and an expression of easy self-possession. We had nodded at each other for 2 weeks before we spoke, the way people do when they share a space often without a formal introduction. Her name was Carol Beaumont. She was a retired family law judge from Oregon, transplanted from the East Coast, who came to this cafe every morning because she liked the light in the corner, and the owner did not play music before noon. We talked for the first time over a shared newspaper someone had left on the counter, and the conversation moved quickly and naturally from current events to her former career to the general subject of estate litigation, at which point I told her, briefly and without drama, what I was dealing with. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she said, "You handled the witness intimidation documentation exactly right." Exactly. We began having breakfast together most mornings. Carol did not give legal advice. She was careful to stay within the boundaries of friendship rather than counsel, but she listened. She asked precise questions, and she had the quality I needed most from another person in those weeks. She believed me without needing me to convince her. She simply took me at my word, as a woman who knew what had happened to her and what she meant to do about it. Some mornings she brought her dog, a small elderly terrier named Rutherford, who slept under the table during our conversations with the calm wisdom of a creature who had found his purpose in simply being there. I found that I looked forward to those mornings with a feeling I eventually recognized as real comfort, the ordinary kind, made of coffee and conversation and the company of someone who expected nothing from you except honesty. It steadied me. I did not realize until Carol how much the months before had isolated me, the motel, the divorce, the shame that sticks to women who end up reduced by circumstances they could not fully control. I had been carrying that isolation as if it were a private condition, a personal failure. Carol's simple, matter-of-fact presence reminded me that it was not. It was simply something that had happened. And things that had happened could be followed by other things. Across the city, Sandra was watching. I knew this because Paul told me that her investigators had been identified, making inquiries at the probate court's administrative office, trying to find out the current status of document submissions, which was public record, but also the timing of my schedule, which was not. She was preparing, and she was watching, and she was waiting for me to make a move that could be used against me. I gave her nothing to use. The phone call came on a Wednesday, 13 days before the scheduled probate hearing, and the voice was Sandra's, but changed, smooth now, careful, warm, even in the acted way of someone who has been coached. "Dorothy," she said, first name, no title, a deliberate informality. "I've been thinking about how things have gone between us, and I'm not proud of how I've handled this. I'd like to meet again. Just the two of us. No attorneys. No Derek. I think we got off to a bad start, and I'd like to try something different." I held the phone and looked out the window at the bare trees on the wet sidewalk. I thought, she is 13 days away from losing everything she thought she was going to get. She is trying a new approach because the old one did not work. "All right," I said. "Where?" She chose a restaurant this time. A proper one, not a cafe. A place called Harbor View with linen napkins and a wine list, the kind of place chosen to project stability and seriousness. She was already seated when I arrived, in a good blazer, her hair done, a glass of water in front of her. She stood when she saw me and offered her hand, which I shook. We ordered food we were both too focused to really taste. And then Sandra began. It started with an apology, structured, sincere-sounding, hitting all the expected notes. She had been overwhelmed by grief. She said she had acted rashly. She was sorry about Derek's visit to Patricia, sorry about the hotel situation. She said this carefully, not quite admitting she had ordered it, but showing she knew about it. She had loved her father, she said, and she had believed she understood his wishes, and she had been wrong to fight the probate so aggressively. I listened. I ate my salad. I said, "I hear you," at appropriate moments. And then the turn came, as I knew it would. Slowly at first, she began describing her childhood, how Robert had come in and out of her life in unpredictable patterns, how her mother had largely raised her alone, how she had chosen as an adult to build a relationship with her father despite the difficulties, to show up for him when no one else did. She was presenting herself as the dutiful daughter who had been there. She was probably not lying about these facts. She was simply choosing which facts to highlight. He was confused in his last years, she said, more than the doctors recorded because he was proud and he hid it. Dorothy, I say this gently, the man who wrote that will was not fully the man who should have been writing it. There it was, under the apology, under the linen napkins and careful warmth. The same argument in new clothes. Sandra, I said, putting down my fork. I appreciate that you reached out. I mean that, but I want to be clear with you about something. I looked at her directly and kept my voice even. I am not going to voluntarily withdraw from this probate process. I am not going to accept a partial settlement. I am going to the hearing in 13 days, and I am going to present my case, and I am confident in the outcome. I paused. I understand that is not what you wanted to hear. Something shifted in her face. The smooth surface cracked in small but visible ways. A tightening around the jaw. A change in the look of her eyes. The warmth drained away like water from a tub. You're making a mistake, she said. Her voice had gone flat. You have told me that before, I said pleasantly. I have things I haven't used yet, she said. Things about the early years of your marriage to Robert, about why he left. I considered this. Then bring them to the hearing, I said. That is what it is for. She leaned forward slightly, dropping the last pretense of warmth. He left you because you were cold, she said, because you were difficult, because he could not breathe. I know this because he told me. My father described his first marriage as suffocating, and you apparently have not changed. I sat with that for a moment. I let it land. The old version of me, the one who had spent 41 years keeping Gerald calm, managing moods, adjusting, shrinking, might have flinched, might have suddenly wondered if it was true, might have offered something, given something up, simply to make the discomfort stop. That woman was still inside me. I could feel her, but I did not let her speak. Thank you for dinner, I said, folding my napkin onto the table and reaching for my coat. I hope the next time we see each other is in a more formal setting. I walked out of Harbor View with steady steps and did not look back. In the cab back to the hotel, I allowed myself to feel the fear that I had kept behind my ribs during the entire dinner. It was real. Sandra's threat about things she had not used yet was not nothing, and whatever Robert had said to her about our marriage could be shaped and shaded into something that sounded damaging. Character attacks were a real legal tactic, even in probate court, even against a 73-year-old woman with a pressed wildflower and a marriage certificate from 1970. But I noticed, as the cab moved through Portland's lit streets, that the fear was not breaking me down. It was instead sharpening something, like cold water on a clear morning. I took out my phone and texted Paul Rest. She threatened additional evidence. We should talk tomorrow. I'm fine. Then I looked out the cab window at the city moving past, and I breathed, and I held myself together, and I thought, 13 more days. The probate hearing was held in the Multnomah County Courthouse on a Thursday in late March. The room was smaller than I had imagined from its formal title, a wood-paneled chamber with fluorescent lights adding to the natural light from one high window, rows of seats that were perhaps half filled with the different parties and their counsel. The judge was a man named Whitfield, precise and unimpressed, with the patience of someone who had heard every kind of family dispute and found none of them surprising. I sat at the petitioner's table with Paul Reston. Sandra sat at the opposing table with her attorney, a man named Gregory Bell, who had the practiced composure of someone charging by the hour. Derek was in the gallery. I noticed him and then put him out of my mind. James Hargrove was there as the estate's original attorney, prepared to give testimony about the circumstances of finding me and the validity of the documentation process. Carol Beaumont was not in the courtroom. This was not her place to be, but she had made me coffee that morning at the cafe and said, "You know everything you need to know. Just say it plainly." I thought of that. The hearing moved forward with the formal logic of legal process. Documents were entered, chains of custody were established, witnesses were sworn in. James Hargrove gave his testimony about the estate and the circumstances of Robert's will. Dr. Ellen Park gave her medical testimony through a written deposition, clear, thorough, specific, showing that Robert had been mentally competent throughout the period in question. His personal attorney, who had flown in from Portland's East Hills, testified about the circumstances of the will's creation and the 2 later amendments, confirming that Robert had been present, engaged, and clear about his intentions at each signing. Then Sandra's attorney presented her case. It was, as Paul had predicted, emotionally ambitious and legally fragile. Gregory Bell called Sandra to the stand, and she gave testimony about her father's declining years, describing memory lapses and confusion in terms that were vivid but clearly lacking medical proof. Bell entered into evidence a letter that he claimed Robert had written to Sandra about 4 years before his death, expressing doubts about his estate plans. The letter was handwritten. Paul Reston asked for time to examine the letter. Judge Whitfield granted it. Paul spent 3 minutes reading it carefully, then approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd note that the handwriting in this document shows several features inconsistent with samples of Mr. Caldwell's handwriting across multiple documented sources from the same time period, including his journal entries. I'd like to request that this exhibit be submitted for forensic document examination before being admitted. Bell objected. The objection was overruled. Judge Whitfield ordered the letter held pending examination. Sandra's composure across the room cracked in a way that was visible if you were watching for it. Her jaw tightened. She exchanged a look with Derek in the gallery, a brief charged look that said something had gone wrong that they had expected to go right. Then it was Paul's turn to cross-examine Sandra. He was precise and unhurried. He established through Sandra's own testimony that she had hired a private investigation firm 3 weeks before I was found. Before James Hargrove had even located me, which meant before Sandra had any legal standing in the estate, he asked her calmly why she would hire investigators before the estate's main beneficiary had been identified. She said it was routine due diligence. He asked who had authorized access to my hotel room on the specific evening in question. She said she did not know what he was talking about. He entered the hotel's keycard log and the Portland Police Bureau report into evidence without comment. He asked her to confirm the date when Derek had visited my daughter Patricia in Augusta. She confirmed it, apparently believing she was clearing something up. She had just confirmed on the record that a person in her employ had contacted a witness in another state during active probate proceedings. He asked her to describe in her own words the nature of the dinner meeting she had arranged with me 13 days earlier, and specifically whether she had represented at that time that no attorneys would be present. She confirmed this. He then asked whether under Oregon probate rules, parties in an active legal dispute are advised by their counsel not to take part in ex parte settlement discussions without attorneys present. Her attorney objected, and that objection was sustained on that specific point. But the pattern was in the record. Then Sandra made the mistake that I think she had been moving toward for weeks without knowing it. Maybe it was the built-up stress, or the realization that the letter was likely to fail forensic examination, or simply that controlled anger eventually demands release. She turned slightly from Paul Reston's questioning and looked directly at me across the room. She was a cold, controlling woman who drove my father away, she said. Not in answer to a question, simply said it into the record. Judge Whitfield looked up from his notes. Paul Reston did not move or react. He simply waited. That is not responsive to any question before you, Judge Whitfield said to Sandra with a careful flatness that was more devastating than anger would have been. She doesn't deserve this, Sandra said, and her voice had risen. He had not seen her in 50 years. She meant nothing to him. He told me. Miss Caldwell, said the judge, you will keep your remarks to the questions asked by counsel. Bell was on his feet, one hand on Sandra's arm, murmuring. Sandra sat back, breathing hard. Derek, in the gallery, had gone very still. In the silence that followed, I sat with my hands folded on the table in front of me and looked at no one in particular. I thought about the wildflower pressed between notebook paper. I thought about Robert's journal sitting in the court record and the sentence I had read in Paul's office. I think about Dorothy more days than not. I wonder if she is happy. I hope she is happy. That was not the writing of a man who had forgotten me or found me cold. That was the writing of a man who had made a terrible decision 50 years ago and spent the rest of his life understanding its cost. He had not forgotten. He had simply not found the courage to come back, right until the end, when he found the courage of paper and ink and legal document and sent me what he could. I felt no triumph in that room. Only something very old and very complicated settling into place like a piece of furniture finally moved to where it should have been all along. The forensic document examination of Sandra's letter took 11 days. The report was 3 pages of technical language that came down to one practical conclusion. The letter was not consistent with Robert Caldwell's handwriting as shown across 14 authenticated reference samples. The ink dating placed its creation within the previous 8 months. Robert had been dead for 14 months. The letter was a forgery. Gregory Bell withdrew from Sandra's representation within 48 hours of the forensic report being delivered to all parties. An attorney withdrawing in the middle of active litigation is a major event, and it told me more about what Bell believed about his client's conduct than anything he would have said directly. Sandra tried to retain new counsel. 3 attorneys declined one after another. This, Paul told me with professional neutrality, was not an unusual response when a central piece of submitted evidence had been found to be fraudulent. The probate hearing resumed for a final session 3 weeks after the first. Sandra appeared without legal representation. Her eventual replacement attorney had withdrawn 4 days earlier for reasons not publicly stated, and she sat alone at her table. She looked smaller than she had at Harborview, smaller than she had at the cafe in the Pearl District. Not smaller in a way that made me feel anything simple. She was Robert's daughter. She had presumably truly cared for him in his final years, whatever her reasons. But she had also submitted a forged document to a court of law, hired investigators to watch and intimidate, contacted my daughter under false pretenses, and arranged an unauthorized search of my belongings. These were not the actions of someone driven only by grief. These were the actions of someone who had decided that what she wanted mattered more than the truth. Judge Whitfield did not take long to decide. The estate's legal standing was clear. The documentation was thorough. The medical testimony was uncontested. And the only challenge to my standing had been built on evidence that had failed forensic examination. He ruled in my favor. 47 million. The estate of Robert James Caldwell passed to Dorothy May Caldwell, my original married name, which I had set aside at remarriage and now quietly reclaimed in the relevant documents, as the lawful beneficiary according to the clear and competently expressed wishes of the decedent. I signed the final documents in Paul Reston's office that afternoon. My hand was steady. James Hargrove was there. Carol Beaumont had offered to come, but I told her I would rather do this part quietly, and she understood because she was the kind of person who understood such things without needing an explanation. I texted her afterward. "It's done." She replied, "Good. Rutherford and I are at the cafe. Come have coffee." I went. The legal consequences for Sandra unfolded in the weeks that followed with the patient pace of systems that do not hurry but do arrive. Submitting a forged document in probate proceedings is a felony in Oregon under the category of fraud upon the court. The district attorney's office opened an investigation. Paul told me that the investigators Sandra had hired were also being looked at for their actions in Augusta, specifically the contact with Patricia, which had crossed several legal boundaries. Derek, the silent boyfriend, disappeared from Sandra's life around that time. This I learned not from any official source, but from Carol, who, being a former judge with a certain network, heard various things through various channels. She mentioned it without details. I did not ask for details. Gerald back in Augusta heard about the estate. The news reached him through mutual acquaintances, as it naturally would in a city that size. Patricia told me he had called her to ask about it. He had been quiet on the phone, she said, and had asked 2 or 3 careful questions and then ended the conversation without his usual breezy confidence. His girlfriend Rhonda was, by all accounts, very interested in the Sycamore Lane house. I did not call Gerald. I felt no special wish to speak to him. What I felt when I thought of him was something with no drama in it, a mild lack of interest, as if thinking about a room I had once lived in and found a little depressing, and was now glad to have moved out of. I stayed in Portland. This surprised me, but it should not have. The city was green and unhurried and had a quality I could only describe as a certain civic lack of pretension that suited me. I found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood with a view of a courtyard garden and morning light that fell the way I liked. It was the first home I had chosen completely for myself, by myself, without accommodation or compromise, in all my 73 years. I bought good furniture, not extravagant. I was not a woman with extravagant instincts, but solid and well-made, chosen because I liked it. I called Patricia and told her to quit her second job. She had been working 2 jobs since her own divorce 4 years earlier. She refused the money at first, as I had known she would, and I told her she had 30 seconds to change her mind before I wired it anyway. And she laughed for the first time in a long time. And so did I. Spring came to Portland early that year, the cherry trees in pale pink bloom, the courtyard garden filling with green. I built routines that were completely my own. Morning walks to the cafe, breakfast with Carol, an afternoon hour with a book by the window. Small things. But small things are what a life is really made of. I enrolled in a watercolor class, something I had always put off. I joined a book club. For the first time in decades, my days had a shape I had chosen for myself. James Hargrove mentioned that Robert had left a sealed letter for Dorothy when the time is right. I did not open it for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, I made coffee and read it. 4 pages, handwritten. He apologized fully, explained 1974 without excuses. The debt, the fear, the cowardice, he named them plainly. At the end, leaving was the worst thing I ever did, and I never stopped knowing it. You deserved better. You always did. I put the letter in the tin box with the marriage certificate and the wildflower. Then I went to meet Carol because the morning was still there to be used. Sandra's consequences came with the patience of systems that do not hurry but do finish what they begin. Charged with fraud upon the court, her legal costs consumed her savings. Derek did not return. 14 months later, a suspended sentence and a fine took most of what was left. Gerald had separated from Rhonda the following winter. Not happy, Patricia said carefully. I did not send him anything. He was a chapter 1 had finished. My life was not perfect. But I had good light, good company, and the knowledge that when everything had been stripped away, I had held on to myself. That was what I was most grateful for. Not the money, myself. That is how a woman of 73, left with nothing but a suitcase and an old tin box, ended up with everything that truly mattered. Dignity cannot be given to you by other people, and it cannot be taken away by them either. Gerald could laugh. Sandra could scheme. The world could put me in a room with a rattling heater. None of it touched what I truly was. It is never too late to refuse the terms someone else has set for your life. What would you have done in that motel lobby? Leave a comment. I'd truly like to know. And if this story moved you, please subscribe. Thank you for listening.